Welcome to the Forest of Thought with me, Ingrid Rieser. In this podcast, we explore the complex ecology of ideas that our lives are embedded in. We wander the forest of thought, taking unfamiliar paths to catch unexpected glimpses of the ideas, concepts, and assumptions that help make up our world. So, the corona crisis has frustrated many of our ideas about the immediate and long-term future. But maybe this disruption can help us catch sight of the ways we think about the future. In the situation of a global pandemic, it's pretty easy to feel like the future is something that happens to us, like a predetermined destination that we better prepare ourselves for and that we have little agency over. But others take the rapid mobilization of society as a sign of how quickly we can change things if we really want to, and how political impossibilities suddenly become possible. And there are those who tell us not to worry, the future is a blank sheet on which to draw what we will. So there are many stories about the future. The question is how different ways of thinking about time influences the future that actually emerges. Could the present moment be different if our ideas about the future were different? How does our understanding of yesterday and today determine what we think is possible for tomorrow? And how are we all entangled in the mysterious process of the world coming into being? That's a lot of questions. Luckily, our guide for this episode is Professor of Educational and Social Futures, Keri Facer.
Our task is to, if you like, create conditions where we're continuously alert to what is going on in the present, to how our ideas of the future are shaping what we can see in the present, and then to seeing what is coming out of it, to see what it is that we are making. And also to know that as we bring different people into the conversation, and as we bring different ideas of the future into the conversation, it allows us to see different things. What we have now is not finished. What we have now is not all that there has been and all that there will be. Underneath what we have now is a massive reservoir and resource and abundance of possibilities that have not been realised.
Keri Facer is Professor of Educational and Social Futures at the University of Bristol and currently visiting Zennström Professor of Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala University. She's spent years working on the relationship between education and the future, and at the moment she's particularly interested in learning practices that respond to disruptive change with care, fairness, and hope. So please follow me now to the outskirts of Uppsala, Sweden, where there's a reasonably sized forest, and in that forest there's a big white water tower set in a small meadow surrounded by trees. And this is where the professor and I settled in for our conversation one spring afternoon. One thing that I was thinking about when I was preparing for this was that I think that we think about the future a lot, but we maybe don't spend a lot of time thinking about how we think about the future. And I think that, something that I really picked up on from reading some of your things as well was that we have this very, pretty linear understanding of time. That we have the past that's happened, and then we have this now. And then right now I feel like we're in this long now, which is this corona crisis now. And then we think that, okay, and then there's the future, which is kind of when this part of life is going to be over. So we have this, past, present, future type of thinking. And what I think was really interesting about reading your work is how you're talking about how actually the past, present, and future might be much more entangled than what we usually think, and affecting and shaping each other. So I was wondering if we could start there and start to tease out a little bit this, or complicate this idea that we usually work with of linear time.
Yes. The field that I work with, which is a field called anticipation studies, which is trying to help us think about precisely how our ideas of the future act on the present, does try to trouble this idea of linear time. Not in the idea that the material world doesn't have a linearity to it, i.e. something grows, but on on the epistemological level, in terms of how our way of thinking about time kind of hops around a lot. So we're sitting here, but as we're sitting here, we've also got this idea of where we might be in an hour or in a few days. We've also got our memories of where we come from, and all of those are kind of mushed up in this thing that that we might call the thick present. So this idea of the present as a really deep time in which our memories and our anticipations of the future are all entangled. And that's a really important kind of subjective experience for all of us, that there is that entanglement of past, present and future all the time in a constant ongoing process. But we're not really supported very often to try to think about how those different temporalities, how those different times are acting on us in the present. And that's really what a lot of us are trying to do when we're getting into these fields that are variously called anticipation studies or future studies or futures literacy, is to try to help us untangle that a little bit. Not because there's actually a right answer, but just to build a bit of reflexivity, really.
Yeah, because one quote that I really liked that you had here was that how our ideas about the future shape what we experience in the present, and the experience of the present shapes our ideas about the past, and the reading of the past informs ideas of future possibility. And so I think that that's a really, if I'm sitting here and I'm worried about what's going to happen to my family or to my job or to my health in the future, then of course it's going to affect me now. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, what I think is possible about the future will of course affect how that future sort of turns out. So how do you start to do that then, to work with the thick present where these things are entangled? How do you do that?
Where I tend to start with people when I'm doing this sort of thing is I'll do a number of things. The first thing is I might ask people to sort of shut their eyes and visualize what they think the relationship is between past, present and future. I might not use those words. I might just say, think about time, think about change. If you had to use a little line or many lines to represent to yourself what that process is, then kind of mentally draw it. And I will often ask people to sort of shut their eyes and to do that. And then as a group I'd ask us to share those images with each other, because what that does is it shows that there isn't a kind of set answer for these relationships, but that we are all often working with different assumptions about that relationship. So for example, a really dominant visual relationship of the relationship between past, present and future at the moment will be the kind of graph. There's a graph with an x-axis and a y-axis, and there'll be a line with an arrow, and particularly for those of us who used to work in climate change, that line goes along a bit and then goes up a lot, and we'll have lots of images like that. So that will be one sort of visual that we're used to, and you might want to say, well, is that the only visual? So another image might be one of the things I was talking with somebody about yesterday was about changing relationships between kind of freedom and control, and we ended up drawing a sort of really two lines that kind of expand and open and then get really, really tight, and expand and open and get really, really tight. And so then you're starting to think about cycles or waves as characterizing the relationship between past, present and future. Other times when I'm thinking more about emergence, then I might, look at these trees around us and think of the growth of a tree as a better representation of time and change. And I suppose from that point you would then start saying, well, what happens if I'm working with these different images? What do they make possible? What do they shut off? What do they open up? And one of the things is that our kind of classic modernist story of progress has been, if you like, the single line and the single arrow story.
Yeah. That's what I have in my head when you ask to visualize. I'm like, I have the line going from left to right.
Yeah,
thank
exactly.
you. It's very,
so
very unique.
Yeah. So there's this classic left-right line.
Yeah.
And then if you add the concept of progress, it's usually bottom left to top right.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's really interesting, I think, is that when we're confronted with significant disruptions and change, so, you know, the first really big one I was dealing with people was around the 2007-8 financial crisis. More recently, we've got the question of climate and collapse, and then obviously we've got coronavirus. And under these situations, if all you've got in your mind as a relationship between past, present, and future is like an arrow going up, then if you hit a crisis, then you end up with like a picture of a broken arrow, which is, all it does is tells you that it's a story of failure. Whereas if you're working with images of cycles or waves or trees, then you hit what looks like a crisis on a single linear line, and you say, well, actually this is a moment for branching, or this is a moment for decline, but there will be growth again, or this is a cycle. And it invites you to say, well, how do I respond if I think that it's a different sort of process at play?
Right.
So that, you know, that's one of the things that I am trying to do when I'm trying to encourage us to reflect on the ways in which we think about time, particularly the ways in which we think about the future, is to just help us become sensitive to these taken for granted ways of framing our situation that we're working with, not to correct them, but quite often to just pluralize them, to become aware that there's different ways that you might do that.
Yeah. So I know that your main area of work has been looking at educational futures, right? So yeah, these questions, but within the framework of education. And there you talk about these three kind of main future visions.
Yeah.
That could potentially be limiting us from imagining how a more desired future could be becoming into being.
Yeah. The language in this whole area is tricky.
Oh God.
It's completely.
Yeah.
We're trying to find. I mean, I think we are actually trying to find a new language for talking about this stuff. So yes, one of the things that I've been doing for a long time. Hello, Bee. Is thinking about the relationship between education and the future, and there are three really dominant stories about that relationship. One of them is, if you like, the optimization narrative. So you say, you know, politicians and others will say the future is going to be X, Y, and Z, usually something glorious and technological. And then your job in education will be understood as preparing young people for that particular future. So seeing the future as a kind of landscape mapped out in which you can make good or bad decisions, as though that landscape is fixed, as though that it's never going to change, and as though you can make a decision for somebody at the age of 14 that will guarantee their kind of successful navigation of this fixed landscape. So that's what you might call the sort of optimization narrative. How do you optimize your chances of success within a fixed future? The second one is the colonization narrative, and this one is where you say, well, we can't know the future, but we can make it. And here, you know, the idea is you develop people who will create a future that we see as desirable. So whether that is a future of global competition or a future of environmental well-being, at that point you're saying, well, we know what we want you to make, and so we're going to mould you to make that. And the third one is the sort of contingency narrative, which is the one where people are starting to confront the issue that the future might not be known. And at that point they say, okay, so education is like the best protection against whatever might come up. So your way of surviving the future is that we equip you with as much as we can so that you can survive in that setting. And there's problems with all of those futures. The first optimization one is that the future isn't fixed. The colonization problem is, you know, do we have the right to tell young people what future they should be making? I mean, the future should have rights of its own, and the students and the young people that we're dealing with should, I feel, be allowed to respond to the future as it emerges in a way that they see as appropriate. And the contingency narrative, my main problem with that is it frames the future just as a sort of set of risks to defend ourselves against. And it also suggests that education can save us, and that's a lot of weight to put on education. We need a whole load of other things to help us navigate. Yeah. There is no doubt that one of the things that we're trying to do when we're doing futures work in education is to expand people's idea of what is possible. And for a lot of people, the assumption that everything will just be business as usual is something that we need to disrupt. I suppose the difficulty that we have at the moment is that disruption is only being framed as something we need to kind of defend ourselves against,
right,
as opposed to recognising that radical and significant change is not only something that's kind of normal, but it's something that humans have responded to. I mean, not always brilliantly, and not at all with any notion of don't worry, we'll all ride through it and have complete control. No, not at all. We're gonna find ourselves required to change in ways that we hadn't planned. But that sort of thing is absolutely a part of what our history has been, and it will be what we have in future. We're living in a complex, dynamic world that will consistently surprise us. So I suppose what I'd say is those three kind of orientations to the future that I mapped out there. I suppose the question is, it's no good just critiquing that. You've got to put something else in there. And I think the sort of thing that myself and some colleagues, particularly Deborah Osberg, are trying to work out is well, what is a different relationship to time in the future that we might want to develop without simply saying we have no responsibility for it. We've got no, or that we're completely passive in a situation of constant change. And that really isn't the point that I am trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that our task is to, if you like, continuously is to create conditions where we're continuously alert to what is going on in the present, to how our ideas of the future are shaping what we can see in the present, and then to seeing what is coming out of it, to see what it is that we are making. And also to know that as we bring different people into the conversation, and as we bring different ideas of the future into the conversation, it allows us to see different things. And our job is to be kind of constantly alert to just what is going on. And to also understanding that what is going on is so complex that it is never finished, What we have now is not finished. What we have now is not all that there has been and all that there will be. Underneath what we have now is a massive reservoir and resource and abundance of possibilities that have not been realised. And so one of the things that I'm concerned with is not like shifting away from the idea that, either that getting caught in a lot of double negatives there. I think what I'm trying to do is to say that there is more that is possible in the world than has yet been realised, and that is both potentially completely disastrous for us as humans, but that reservoir of possibility also allows us to say things do not have to be as they are at the moment. And that's it, is underneath this present moment is such richness. And our job, if you like, is to kind of be attentive to that, to notice what's going on. And a lot of what we're trying to do with this sort of work is to kind of increase our senses, our capacity for seeing what's happening and what's emerging, and allowing that to be a resource for us, even in moments of really deep despair. And at the same time, and this is where I turn to somebody called Margaret Archer, who's a sociologist, cultural theorist of education. And she's looked at how people respond to change in all sorts of different ways. And her suggestion at the moment is that we're shifting between what she calls fractured reflexivity or spontaneous reflexivity. And the fractured reflexivity she talks about is when we, if you like, we wake up and we become alert to everything that's going on, and then we just get pulled in 55 million different directions.
Right.
You know, so you've got this whole sense of this world that's happening, and you go, where do I focus? What do I do?
Right.
And you just get pulled. And I mean, obviously our social media environment doesn't help us there. It's always drawing our attention to things. And her argument is that you've got that form of fractured reflexivity, and the counter to that is also a kind of deep engagement with one's own values, with one's own sense of what it is you're trying to create. And there she sort of implies that we might have a relationship with this dynamic, rich, thick present where so much is going on at the moment that is like I see it as a dance. You know, I know who I am, and I am looking at all these possibilities to see which ones I might connect with, which ones I might deepen, which ones I might draw, and which ones I might kind of encourage and strengthen. But you need, therefore, not only to be looking outside at the nature of time and the nature of the future, but to be looking inside at yourself and really trying to understand, and this is hard work, you know, who you are and what you care for and what you love and what denials you're engaged with and what
That's a tricky one.
What you're not telling yourself or admitting to yourself.
No, I think that's super useful because it kind of connects back to something that Pella Thiel and I talked about in the previous episode, which was if we accept uncertainty as kind of a fundamental feature of the universe and our societies, what Pella and I talked about was having how do we have agency in those situations and act into situations without trying to control them in a way.
I mean, one of the things that I found useful is to think of ourselves as processes in a world of processes. So rather than thinking of ourselves as kind of these kind of coherent individuals who kind of impact on the world that exists out there, and if only we can find the right spot, we've got it all sorted. So I mean, I think I quite like the idea of understanding our work almost as sort of amplifying waves or processes that are already there, or sort of, I don't know, throwing stones in streams that are shifting along. There's something about needing to have a necessary modesty about what it is that we are trying to do, but also not underestimating the capacity to do some things. So I find it helpful to think about ourselves in a kind of process way, really. So, as we are all flows, how do our particular flows relate to others? But that's a metaphor, and again, you know, it will have its limits. I suppose the second thing is that the world is not completely uncertain. I mean, there are certainties, there are continuities, there are solidarities that we can create. So, one of the things that we decide to do, you know, when you choose to marry somebody, for example, is you make a promise. And you say, I will be with you for thick and thin, rich or poorer, you know, better, worse, all of that sort of stuff. And a promise is one of the ways of building solidarity or certainty in an uncertain world. And it always comes with limits. You can't guarantee that you can fulfill that all the time, but it's a commitment. And so that's one form of certainty we can think about. We can also think about the certainties of kind of tendencies, and the tendencies of changes historically can be to make life much, much worse for the most vulnerable, for example. So if we know that that is a tendency of radical change, then that's a space that we can start to work, and we can start to say, well, under these situations with these sorts of changes happening, how might we really draw attention to that? How might we work on that? So I suppose what I would caution, again, we are in a radically dynamic universe that is throwing things up that we can't anticipate, but we can make commitments, we can work at different sets of scale, we can see patterns. All the time knowing that that's going to be challenged as things change. So those are some of the things that I think about in relation to agency.
And I think that that's that part about the continuity, certainties, and tendencies and commitments, and that's very useful, because I think also the world is an uncertain place. It's not a great story, sort of. Is there? Yeah, I don't know.
But I think that's a really important point, this question of, because there is a bit of a fetishization of uncertainty amongst, don't worry, it's, amongst various kind of, amongst a whole range of groups, really. The military have got this concept of a VUCA world, which is volatile, uncertain. I can't remember what the other two things stand for, but and arguably they've got an interest in building people's anxiety that the world is critically volatile, because what do you do under those circumstances? People get scared and they buy big guns. We've seen what's happened in other places, particularly with the pandemic, that a sense of uncertainty can lead in certain situations to really, really horrible behaviour. And one, the uncertainty narrative can be fueled for bad effect. Two, the uncertainty narrative as a kind of playful thing ignores the fact that for some people radical uncertainty is hugely problematic, because it means they don't know when they're going to get any food, and they don't know if they're going to be able to look after their kids and so forth. So I suppose what I'm trying to say here is uncertainty is not a kind of normative statement, it's a description. Exactly. It is a description of radical uncertainty, and then, as we've said, there are some ways of creating security, not security, it's creating some form of certainty within that are to do with things like promises and solidarity and commitment, and having resources that will allow you to respond to it. So we need to recognise that people are differentially positioned in the ability to kind of make the most of uncertainty. And then the question becomes one of care, actually. How do we care for different groups under these different circumstances? It's interesting. I was on a conversation yesterday with my hometown in Bristol. It was a conversation with the mayor and a load of other people about how the city's going to respond. And as we were talking, you suddenly thought, actually, there's a whole load of people who've dealt with really difficult situations in the past, really having to confront uncertainty, who've got real resources that we can learn from here as well. So there's, so for example, in relation to the pandemic, what's very clear is that the communities that have had to deal with the AIDS epidemic over the last 20 years have serious skills in helping us understand how to respond to that, whether that's the LGBTQ communities, in my hometown, or it's the people in informal settlements in South Africa. They've all had to deal with this, and they've had to deal with that uncertainty, and they've learnt from it. So there's a lot we can get from attending to how people have coped with critical uncertainties in the past. So it's not as simple as saying that those people who've got wealth and resources will survive uncertainty. There are actually all sorts of different things that are needed to allow us to respond to uncertainty well. It's complicated.
But I think it is really useful to try to sort through some of those, complications, contradictions, and etc. Because I think there is a tendency for us to, when confronted with an uncomfortable situation, which is, or maybe a shocking situation, or a situation of crisis like now, there's a tendency to maybe respond to that as like, okay, well, how do I solve this, or how do I fix this? And then to develop the resources needed to maybe be with the not knowing for a bit longer.
One of the things when this all kicked off, I found myself, living in Sweden in a flat that doesn't belong to me with no garden, which was like not the plan when crisis was due to hit, you know. And I, like everybody, I think, sort of struggled for a while to get my head around what was going on. And I ended up sitting down and thinking, well, what on earth is what I've learnt doing all this work on future stuff? Well, you know, what on earth has that given me as a resource now? And I think what it did was allow me to notice the images of the future that I was working with during the virus and think about how I was responding to them. So, for example, I mean, I would go running here each morning and I noticed that there was a certain thing that would go through my mind that would literally stop me physically from being able to run. It would just hit me. And it's like, okay, so I need to pay attention to that. And it was, you know, an image to do with what I was worried might happen to my parents, you know, and it was a real kind of concern about this future. Yeah. And at that point, I just thought, well, is it remotely helpful to think about that? And it's not about saying it's not going to happen, but it is just about saying, well, what is it doing to me? And what is it doing to my work? You know, how do I notice that image and think about, well, what does that mean in terms of what I can see now? And what's unhelpful about it is the kind of bringing on of a paralysis that means you can't run anymore. What's helpful about it is going, okay, so that means you phone your parents. You know, you make the most of what you've got, you connect with them. So I think this is the thing, is constantly being aware that the future doesn't exist. You know, that future that I had in mind is not here yet. And that's why we have to be careful with the ideas of the future we have, because they basically bring other realities into our present and almost require us bodily to respond to them. So we have to stop that and notice that they're coming in, but then also notice that they aren't real. I mean, fundamentally, the future does not exist. It is not a living thing right now. So any ideas we have of it are precisely that, ideas. And so we have to attend to how we're working with those ideas and think about which ones are useful or generative to work with in the present.
Yeah, and maybe we could talk about in that, I mean, that was an example of things that we maybe are not so useful. What about, could we talk a little bit about, you know, utopias or dreaming or the visions and how that is useful and complicated as well? Yeah,
I mean, the work I find really useful here is Ruth Levitas's work. So she talks about utopia as method, and Ernst Bloch. She draws on Ernst Bloch a lot, who was one of the critical theorists, but who stayed in Europe. And really what they're talking about there is utopia as a way of unsettling your assumption of how things are and could be in the world. So it's about the creation of ideas that allow you to look at the present and say, how does the present relate to this? Okay, so you see it as a kind of useful disruption. It's almost a sort of eruption in the present. And it goes back to the thing that I was saying earlier, which is of the present as recognizing that there is more in the present than has yet been manifested. So utopian ideas can do that. The point at which they get really dangerous, and the reason why kind of utopian thinking fell into quite a lot of disrepute, is that it got associated with kind of blueprint thinking. So you have this vision of the future and then you try and march everybody towards it. And when reality doesn't respond to you, then you end up, you know, causing a huge amount of harm as you try and make it fit your vision. And so I think it's more useful to think about utopias and possibilities and futures, you know, desirable futures, not as kind of routes or endpoints to march towards, but as challenges to see different possibilities in the present. And then, you know, you work dynamically, you work with what's emerging, you work with what's coming up. You don't try and squish everybody into your blueprint vision.
Yeah, so more as a bouncing board, in a way.
It's a bouncing board, but it can also be a sort of summoning, a calling forth. I think there's something more magical about it. I mean, futures are quite magical, really, aren't they? You know, the idea that the world might be different from what it is now is completely magical.
Yeah, and that would maybe be also something to pick up on, is this: how do we do this exploration and also the dreaming together with others.
Yeah.
Which is also something that you've written a bit about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things is a lot of the futures that we're being given these days are sort of political futures constructed by other people for aims that are not our own. So one of the things that I think we urgently need to do is to create the public spaces and the conversations that allow us to have allow us to share with each other what the hell it is we think is going on. So I mean, there's a huge amount going on around participatory futures work and democratic futures practices, and quite a lot of the things that we've been trying to do this year and that I'm really excited by globally are that people are starting to organise into groups and starting to look at the possibility. I mean, it's a scary moment, but to look at the possibility that the future might not just be business as usual, right? So. And really opening that up in a way that I don't think has been since like the 1970s, actually. So I think, it's quite exciting. We don't know how to do it yet. We're learning. It'd be nice not to do it in the way that we did in the 70s, which was all very much, huge. There were huge problems with that process because quite often there is a sense that you just take all the limits off, you take all the structures out. And it's all a free-for-all. Anybody's idea goes, and the danger with that is that the loudest voices, those with the most power, historically white men, their voices get heard a lot. And so I think one of the things that would be nice not to do this time is to go down that route. And I think we are now at a point where we know that we need to listen to very, very many and different life experiences as we're trying to imagine futures.
And I mean, that's something that I have also reflected on. I mean, having been in the sort of sustainability world for a while, you do, you've been I at least have been engaged in various, scenario building or brainstorming kind of activities where you're supposed to sort of create this vision of this world that we would like to live in. And I always leave those sessions like quite depressed, to be honest, because I don't know what it is about me. I mean, I think that the tricky thing about utopias or visions is that, if it's not utopian enough, then it's just feels disappointing. You just feel like, well, we could do better. And then if it's too utopian, then you're like, oh, well, this is totally unrealistic, and isn't it? And probably also the problem is that I think that we were using it as this blueprint type of framing, like you said, and I feel like the times when these visions of a better world, or these utopian ideas that get you, for me it's almost more like fleeting moments or like textures, or it's very subtle. So I have a feeling that when we're attending to what the present is, what is arising in the present, then it requires a lot of subtlety, or working with subtlety, I feel. And maybe that's also another way to talk about care, but it's kind of the opposite of this loudest voice wins, and it's a very tricky thing, I feel, to navigate, and I don't know.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's a really interesting point. I mean, there's the old E.M. Forster book, what's it called? Howard's End. Do you remember Howard's End?
Yeah.
And there's a phrase in it, "only connect," which is this point about just noticing and trying to constantly notice and stay alert and stay awake. And Hannah Arendt talks about that as well. She talks about that in terms of how did the Second World War become possible? She says it became possible because people stopped thinking and they stopped making connections. And that's why, if we're thinking about what we have to attend to now, again, in this kind of thick present that we've got, is we have to attend to the utopian moments, but we also have to attend to the fact that life is a living hell for some people right now. I mean, so it's just, you're always sort of moving in between. It's a dynamic position. It isn't a position of certainty or knowledge or this is exactly the right thing. It is a position that kind of has to hold all these things in balance at the same time. And then also acknowledges. I've got some people in my mind. I realise that I'm talking here. I've got say Vanessa Andreotti in my mind, or Sarah Amsler, and they will be asking sort of what are your desires at this point as well. So there, is there a desire to be a saviour? Is there a desire to fix things that can't be fixed? Is there a desire to deny your own complicity in what's going on? And so I think you've got an outward alertness and an inward alertness. But I do think it needs to be held lightly. It can't be held in this kind of virtuous way. It's like the light on these leaves. It's constant and changing and shimmering. It's never going to stay the same.
So I listened to a talk that you gave at a conference a while back, and you were talking about how if we want to move beyond systems that we have built that are not working for us anymore, you asked, what happens when we think of the beyond as something that requires a radical break in who we are, a transformation, a passage from life to what looks like death to us now? And I was wondering if you wanted to read the rest of that section.
I think also, just to put some context to this, I suppose what I was invited to do there was to think about beyond oil. And quite often the way in which we think about futures or what comes next is either like today but with some better stuff in it, or the opposite of today. Do you know what I mean? It can be quite binary. Yeah. And I suppose the thing I'm trying to say is it is almost necessarily transformative. It almost necessarily will become something very, very different. Anyway, so what I said, I think I was talking about the invitation to think beyond oil, and I said, this invites us to think impossible thoughts, to know that radical novelty is possible, but that we will in turn be radically transformed in the process, that we will simply not be the same people afterwards. It invites us to consider that we may be in a generative universe, a universe in which what we have in the world now is not all that there will be in the world. Radical novelty is possible, good or bad. I would actually say it's inevitable. It invites us to think of darkness, of lack of foresight, of not being able to see clearly. It invites us to think of the generative power of the dark, of the velvety, exciting, shadowy richness that emerges from lack of clarity. It encourages talk of monsters. It reminds us that we live in a universe of dispositional realism. All that can be has not yet been. All that can be has not and will not be exhausted. The latent forces have not all been actualized, put into dialogue, collided in all the ways that they might be. Dark matter makes up 27% of the mass of our universe. We are groping about in the unknown. We are not masters of the universe. We're generative, creative forces with huge power and no power, which we do not yet fully know or understand. We are in the dark.
What I really liked about that piece was, or that quote was, I think that you really captured how there's that the terrifying and yet thrilling and beautiful side to this, to the future that it is, and that novelty in itself is such a mystery, really. Like how does that even happen, that something completely new can come into being? I mean, it is in a way such a profound thing that we don't really reflect on or think about, because we take it so for granted.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think two things looking back at that quote. One is that actually I really love science. There's a lot of desire to sort of say science has got us into all sorts of trouble, but I actually think observational science, the science of inquiry, which is trying to work out, what the hell is going on, where does this new thing come from, is wonderful and curious and life affirming, and is a practice and a process that we should not be demonizing right now. It's when it hits capitalism and that it causes all sorts of trouble. Anyway, but the other thing that occurs to me is the dark is hard to navigate for too long and on your own, So what I would say is that we want to be thinking about creating relations with each other that allow us to walk into darkness together. We do not know what's coming, but it feels a hell of a lot better if you're holding somebody's hand than if you're there on your own. Yeah. Although sometimes you do have to do it on your own. Sometimes you, particularly in your own life, when you have to take necessary risks in order to work out who you can be, and that requires a moment of walking on your own into the dark and being scared and then seeing what emerges.
I've also heard you talk a bit about where are really fruitful areas of work, whereas there are a lot of things, diversity happening, and you also use the metaphor of ecotones, which is the boundary area between ecosystems. Could you say a little bit about that as well?
Well, I mean, this sort of came out of my trying to think about, what do we think an educational moment is, if it isn't about, indoctrination in a particular way of being in the world, but that is future oriented in some way. And I think I was trying to say that we want to create conditions of encounter between different differences, different experiences, different sets of knowledge, different histories. And so the metaphor of the ecotone feels generative to me in relation to think about past, present and future.
What is the ecotone?
So an ecotone is the point. I mean, we're probably sitting in one actually. It's a connection between a forest and a meadowland, and the bit where it overlaps, where all sorts of different living things grow that wouldn't survive in the forest, or they wouldn't survive in the meadow, but they survive in this kind of interim space. It's a place of kind of mutants. It's a place of, monsters that might only grow there. And I've always thought about it in temporal terms rather than spatial terms, which is, it's the time between things. And that's what we live in. We live in a time between things, but it's a really rich time, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. So we live in a time between these ideas of the future and the histories that we've got. So we're like these creatures living in this, and we've got, the point is to sort of cross-fertilise between those different temporalities. So how can we merge our ideas of the future with the resources that we have in the past to create something new monsters, new beings. And I was thinking that actually educational spaces should be really safe spaces to generate that. They should be places where kids are allowed to invent themselves or invent things that may not become their reality when they're grown up, And I think that's the case for all of us. How do we create moments where we can be generative with our thinking, knowing that we're living in this rich present, knowing that we've got our histories, knowing that we've got these possible ideas of the future? What can we proliferate in the present to see what emerges? I think the reason I want to sort of stress this is because our culture is very, very future obsessed and past obsessed.
Right.
And so everything has to be justified in relation to this particular future that's going to be realised, or it has to be justified in relation to this golden past that we've lost behind or we need to rediscover. And actually, creating a respect for the present as the time in which we're living that encompasses both of those, and that is the generative space. We can't act anywhere else. We live now. That's it. That's what we've got. And this is the generative space, I think, is is important, is an important thing to recover. I mean, it's interesting because all the way through this conversation we've been talking, and we have left untroubled this idea of past, present and future. And yet actually lots of different cultures and traditions don't see it like that. I mean, they might see the past, present and the future as kind of overlaying each other, and you can move into and between them. So,
right.
You know, there's a huge amount more work that needs to be done on pluralizing our conceptions of time. You know, it's really hard to get out of it. But the main thing that I take away from those as well as from this is that we only have the present is what we're in, and we are playing with, you know, we're living with ghosts and we're living with imaginations of possible futures, and it's a really interesting place to be.
Yeah. So I know you've also been thinking about stories.
Yeah.
and that stories are always playing with time.
Yeah.
And that if we allow ourselves to use the language of story or myth or poetry, then maybe we can start to access things that are, you know, otherwise missing in our sense making, in our world making kind of endeavors. And so I asked you if you wanted to bring a poem or a story to kind of leave us with a morsel of thought before we round things off.
I love it. Sorry. I think also I just love the fact that what we've got this kind of song playing which has got, you know, Laurel and Hardy going through my mind, and then myself as a child running out for ice cream, and it's sort of resonating through this forest. And I think it's really helpful because it's like nothing is pure, it's all mushed up.
It's all muddled
it's
together.
all mushed up.
There's the water tower and there's
a kind of UFO water tower here. There's this beautiful forest, there's this ice cream van. I mean, we could create an amazing story out of that, I'm sure, at some point. You know, what becomes possible when you collide all of these unexpected things together, and that is really what's going on all the time in life. So, I mean, actually, I think about stories, though, the thing I'm really keen on is that we remind ourselves of our capacity to invent our own stories as well, not just to inherit them from other people. Anyway, so the thing that just came to my mind when you asked me here, you know, what is there a story or anything else that you would want to bring, was weirdly the T.S. Eliot East Coker poem came into my head, which I've not read for years and years and years. But he wrote an amazing piece called Tradition and the Individual Talent, which I read, 20 years ago, which was all about the things that we're talking about now. It was about the relationship between the past and the present and the future, and how history and tradition connect with the new person, the new that emerges, and the relationship between the two of them. And I think that's really what we're trying to get at here, is how do we insert ourselves as something new in a world that is pre-existing, and allow something good to emerge out of that. Anyway, so as a little bit from right at the beginning, there is, it seems to us, at best, only a limited value in the knowledge derived from experience. The knowledge imposes a pattern and falsifies, for the pattern is new in every moment, and every moment is a new and shocking valuation of all we have been. We are only undeceived of that which, deceiving, could no longer harm. In the middle, not only in the middle of the way, but all the way, in a dark wood, in a bramble, on the edge of a grimpen, where is no secure foothold, and menaced by monsters, fancy lights, risking enchantment. I love the idea of risking enchantment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ingrid. It's been fun.
Thank you, forest, water tower, and meadow as well.
And ice cream van.
And ice cream man and the wind.
And the wind.
You can find the sources to things that we talked about and more in the show notes. And a special thanks this episode to Emma, Felicia, Mai, and Isak, and of course Keri. Thanks to Christian at stoneproduction.no for our wonderful theme music. And we're also looking for suggestions for topics or interviewees that we think we should explore in the podcast. So please be in touch on Instagram or Facebook or the website forestofthought.com, or you can email me at ingrid@forestofthought.com. So thank you so much again for listening, and I'll speak to you next time.